My book, The Next Big Thing, came out in May of last year through Pitch Publishing. I've been asked a lot of times where the idea came from, and the honest answer is I can't remember. It feels like so long ago now. The book was a couple of years in the making. So yeah, we're going back probably to sort of 2017 time when I first came up with the idea and started to flesh it out. But I remember early discussions with my friends, with my partner, just fleshing out the idea and talking about how I had the idea for this book. Just because it intrigued me, really, I think, as much as anything else. I think if it's something I'm interested in, then maybe there'll be a few other people who are interested in it too. So the idea was to take a look at young footballers who were tipped for the top at the beginning of their careers, very early on in their teens and early 20s, who never quite made it, and to dig into the different reasons why that can happen. I figured that the only way this would be a book rather than a series of articles online or in a magazine or something like that would be if I could get access to the players. So I began to draw up a list of, I probably had about 60 or so different players who I thought would fit the bill, who were all really talented kids when they were younger, who never quite went on to fulfill their potential. Some got further than others, some kind of fell at early hurdles, others went quite far before tailing off, but they all kind of fit with the general theme of having all the talent and everything you would want in place, but things for whatever reason just never quite worked out for them. So yeah, once I got that list together, I began working through it and trying to contact the players, trying to reach them in any way I could. You could probably think of the names yourself, that most of them are quite well known. Suffice to say, I didn't get the whole list of 60. I was aiming for, I think I had the idea of getting around 12, and I thought if I could get that far, then that's enough for a book, and in the end I got 15. So we've got players from the players who play for Inter Milan, Ajax, Man United. There are 4 Man United players in there. Liverpool, Everton. So yeah, lots of big clubs and players who you would recognise. Guys like Ben Thornley, who was famously the standout player of the class of '92 in that run to the Youth Cup way back when, with Giggs and Beckham and Neville and the likes of those players. He was widely regarded to be the most talented of that crop, or certainly on a level with those guys. But injury was his reason for never being able to fulfill his potential. But there were lots of other reasons I wanted to explore as well. So in hunting down these players, there were some I couldn't get hold of. Some just weren't willing to share their stories. I think it's in a lot of ways some of the stories are quite difficult, and I think the people involved have to be in a place where they've kind of processed it and worked through it themselves before they're willing and ready to share them with the wider world. So yeah, I was incredibly grateful for the 15 who were ready to share their stories with me. And in terms of a timeline, they go right from a player who was around in the mid-'80s with Tottenham, a guy called Ali Dick, who was a Scottish youth international who went on to play for Ajax as well, who at 16 was playing for Tottenham and was really, really gifted winger. But again, injuries with him really scuppered his career a little bit later on. So it goes right from the 80s all through the Premier League era with the class of '92, and then guys in the later 90s like Danny Cadamarteri, Matt Murray from Wolves, and then you go into the 2000s with guys like John Bostock, and the most recent player who was featured is a former Liverpool striker called Adam Morgan, who scored a lot of goals in the youth teams for Liverpool, and for different reasons he didn't quite fulfill his potential. He's still only about 25, I think. So there's a real scope, and it's quite interesting also alongside the personal stories to trace the rise of the Premier League alongside that and the influx of money, and see how that impacted things too. Because some of the players who came along a little bit later, perhaps were able to kind of protect themselves financially a little bit more than the guys earlier on were when the money wasn't quite there. So yeah, I tracked these guys down. Some, as I say, weren't ready to speak. Some preferred not to do it. Some I couldn't contact. But the ones I did, I interviewed them. in person when I met them. Most of them I would say I spent an hour or two with, going through their whole life story, their career, what it was like to be a quote-unquote Wonderkid, and how their careers never quite panned out, and the reasons behind that, and then where their lives went after that, and how they dealt with it, and what they did instead, and where they are now, and what they're doing. So yeah, there's some really fascinating stories in there. Lots of different reasons for why they never quite were able to fulfill their potential. In the case of Andy van der Meijden, who was a Dutch international winger who played for Ajax and Inter Milan, he was a fascinating person to speak to. I went out to Amsterdam to meet with him, and he told me about how when he was in his early 20s, he was really thriving with a vibrant young Ajax team under Ronald Koeman. And then he was kind of sold to Inter against his will. He didn't want to leave. Didn't feel ready for the move. And then when he went to join Inter in Milan, the manager Hector Cooper didn't know who he was, because he was a signing of the sporting director. So he never really got to play. So he was languishing on the bench, or not even in the squad, and he fell into alcoholism. And by the time he moved to Everton, he played 10 games in 4 years for Everton, and retired at the age of 29, but carried on living in Liverpool, but became involved with drugs, and was heavily into cocaine, and his life really began to spiral. He had problems with his family life as well. So it's really just this story of how one little moment where he was called up from training with Ajax to the director's office and told that he was leaving, and he had to pack his bags and go to Milan. For many people that would be a dream move, but for him at that age, he wasn't ready for that, and that kind of just led to this butterfly effect of all this chaos that has surrounded him since. So his was a really fascinating and in many ways quite bombastic story. It's the one that I think is the kind of most explosive, probably most often quoted story from the book. So yeah, it just gives an example of how things can go wrong for a player when everything is seemingly on track and going to plan, and even that their dreams are there on a plate for them. It's just not always the case. So yeah, I have these 15 players, and that was what made the book in the end. And I went back as well and spoke to colleagues of these players as well to flesh out their stories and get different perspectives. So it's not all just these players' stories in their own words. There's contributions from teammates, from coaches who've worked with them, from members of the media who covered their careers, to get a really comprehensive overview of each of their stories. Put them all together, and the book runs pretty much chronologically from the furthest back to the most recent story, and it's all kind of under the umbrella of how these quote-unquote Wonderkids can fail to live up to their potential, what protections are in place for them, and what becomes of them when the dream fades, what's left when the dream fades away. That was the purpose of the book, and that was what I set out to accomplish with it. And luckily a few people seem to have quite enjoyed it, and I hope those who come to the book in the future will find it interesting too.